to OSCE Parliamentary Assembly's web dialogue on violence against women journalists and politicians, a growing crisis. My name is Hanna Djogovic, and I work as Program Officer for the OSCE PA's International Secretariat in Vienna. Today, I will be facilitating this event. Over the next 2 hours, we will be exploring and exchanging views on the challenges women journalists and politicians continue to face in their everyday work. Violence against women, as statistics show, affects at least 1 in 3 women in their lifetime. While many of them experience violence in the private sphere, it would be incorrect to assume that the public sphere provides safety. Hence, the topic we're tackling today is very sensitive, yet extremely important, since we will all agree that the impact of such violence goes well beyond physical and mental health challenges. In this context, we all believe that parliamentarians have an important role to play to address this issue, and that it is vital to hear from each other and learn from our successes and failures. This is why the OSCE PA gives particular importance to events such as this one. In fact, we believe that they give an opportunity to combine expert advice with the important powers parliamentarians have at their disposal in their national capacities, all in order to identify best practices in adopting and implementing legislative and policy frameworks to protect journalists and politicians, including women and men. Moving to today's agenda, in a moment, we will start with the opening remarks, which will officially launch the event. These will be followed by the expert panel, after which we will have a lively debate among participants, keeping in focus both the regional dynamics and the specific role of parliamentarians. Finally, we will have concluding remarks summarizing highlights of the expert presentations and discussion. Allow me now just a few technical announcements before we begin. Please note that this event is being recorded and live streamed on OSCE PA YouTube channel and Facebook page. It is taking place in English language exclusively. Online requests to speak should be written in the chat. My colleagues will collect all the requests and I will then give you the floor during the debate. To ensure a smooth experience, I kindly ask all of you to mute your microphones when not speaking. And likewise, please unmute your microphone only when given the floor. I would also like to encourage everyone to keep your cameras on during the entire event, as this is also an opportunity to see and virtually meet with your colleagues, since COVID-19 pandemic continues to prevent us in meeting in person. Finally, I would like to encourage all speakers from the floor to limit their interventions to maximum 3 minutes during the debate. Without further delay, we will now see a pre-recorded video message from the President of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, Ms. Margareta Cederfeld, who unfortunately is not able to join us live today due to her official visit to Turkey. Ms. Cederfeld, I'm sure you are already aware, is a distinguished Swedish parliamentarian who was elected last July as OSCE PA President. I would kindly now ask our IT support to play the video.
Esteemed guests, fellow parliamentarians, dear colleagues and friends, thank you very much for joining us today. It is with great pleasure that I witness once again your active engagement in the work of our Parliamentary Assembly. I am particularly honored to open this extremely timely debate, this time from the position as President of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. My introduction would not be complete without conveying on behalf of the Assembly and me personally, the utmost recognition and respect to our Special Representative on Gender Issue, Dr. Heidi Frey from Canada. Dear Heidi, your tireless and result-oriented engagement throughout past 10 years of your tenure, as well as your personal and political activism, are indeed remarkable. And what you have done to highlight the gender issue on the agenda in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly is fantastic. You have raised the issue. You have made it possible for women to take political positions and continue this fantastic work, Heidi, because it's needed. My warm welcome also goes to our distinguished expert panelists from the OSCE family and beyond. We are truly looking forward to hearing your presentations on the important topic of combating violence against women, journalists and politicians. In fact, in the BA, we often rely on expert advice. In my view, such comprehensive approach is vital to enhance the role of parliamentarians in important issues, including this one. Dear colleagues, unfortunately, due to other obligations, I am not able to follow this event live, but I cannot highlight its importance more. The focus of today's discussion is fundamental for the future of our societies, and it remains relevant to each and every one of us, irrespective of our profession, background, gender, or beliefs. Progress in terms of addressing gender-based violence has been largely asthmatic over the course of the past 20 years. We simply cannot deny that this kind of violence is still present in every aspect of social activity today, including among journalists and politicians. While both women and men in these fields face particular challenges to their safety by the nature of their jobs, disparities in relation to gender are adding to the issue. They indeed affect people engaged in these fields differently. The statistics speak for themselves. They show that we are in fact failing to protect safety of women engaged in the field of media and politics, which are key components of our modern democracies. As we engage in discussion on this topic today, let us keep in mind that the developing awareness of this problem is crucial. At the same time, it should be followed concrete, timely, and pertinent actions. Coming from Sweden, I am proud that my country has already adopted strong legislative framework and strengthened the agenda on addressing gender-based violence. But I must admit that there is a need to do more. Good examples should not be used as excuse for turning our backs to the fast evolving challenges. To respond to them, we should do our utmost to make sure that our policies and laws are always up to date. In this regard, our Assembly has adopted in 2018 its resolution on preventing and combating gender-based violence, which I believe should be largely taken on board during the discussion today. Dear colleagues, we should be resolute in strengthening efforts to protect women and to speak up in support of victims wherever and whoever they might be. I will conclude by highlighting the following. Gender-based violence is threatening our democratic safeguards. It is only by addressing this issue in a systematic manner that we can truly progress towards more inclusive and peaceful societies. As parliamentarians, we can and we should champion policies and laws that prevent gender-based violence and, of course, take care of the implementation and follow-up. I wish you a fruitful debate. Thank you.
Thank you for these introductory words, President Satterfeld, and for highlighting the need to do more in this regard. This is also a perfect introduction to our next welcoming speaker, Mr. Roberto Montella, who is the Secretary General of the OSCE, and without whose support this event would not have been possible. Dear Roberto, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and congratulations on putting up this event. This is your first event, I think, in your new capacity, so good luck, and I wish us all good work. Violence against women and journalists and politicians. It is indeed a topic that should deeply concern us all. And As you know, the Parliamentary Web Dialogue takes place within the framework of the OSCPA's work in advancing dialogue, sharing good practices, and promoting inclusive approaches to gender mainstreaming and in policy making. I would like to welcome the experts. Thank you very much for your time and for participating in this event. We very much value the contribution of experts. Also, I would like to recognize Teresa here. Thank you very much, Teresa, for participating, and also the colleagues from ODIHR and the other experts. But we very much value the contribution of experts in our debates in the Parliamentary Assembly, because it gives us the possibility also to have different views that then politicians who are connected, and I also welcome the 65 participants. So it's a topic that has raised a lot of interest in all our delegations. But it gives the politicians the possibility then to ensure that proper legislation, policies and mechanisms to protect women working in their professions are adopted and most importantly implemented. Dear colleagues, leading by example is vital for the effective promotion of multilateral and meaningful engagement in our societies. In our Parliamentary Assembly, we've had now 3 women who have been leaders of this assembly. Also in our bureau, we have a good balance, and of this I'm pretty much proud of. Our assembly has also been fundamental, and I think the person who is here leading these issues in our assembly is an iconic figure, I'd say, Dr. Fry. Hedy, I see you, it's 5 a.m. In your part of the world, but you are very much fired up and ready to go. So we look forward to hearing your remarks, and I will try to take as little as possible time from your remarks, because I think you have in this assembly really set milestones and converted many, I would say, mindsets in our assemblies, maybe distracted mindsets, maybe mindsets which were sometimes on the wrong side of this topic. But I must say, with your example, with your stamina, with your strength in all our events, you really give us a wake-up call. And for this, I'm very grateful to you. Also, at the Secretariat, we have tried to implement as much as possible this policy. And I'm also happy to report that recently 2 senior appointments in our Secretariat have been both women, 2 women who will have a leading role both in the Copenhagen office and in the Vienna office. So I'd say we leave the floor to the expert. We leave the floor to you, Hedy, because we are in a learning, I think, posture here. But I look forward from the outcome of this debate, and I look forward to see some practical conclusions also that we can draw from this debate. Hannah, I yield back the floor to you, and congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Secretary General, for these encouraging words and for always giving great importance to the work of gender portfolio within the International Secretariat of the OSCPA. Thank you. This brings us to Dr. Hedy Fry from Canada, who I believe doesn't need special introduction. She was appointed as the OSCPA Special Representative on Gender Issues already in October 2010, and she has been reappointed in the following years. She is the longest serving female member of Canadian Parliament, and her work greatly focuses on women's equality, social policy, arts and culture, homelessness, and the rights of LGBT community. At this point, I would like to highlight also that today's event serves as an opportunity to launch Dr. Fry's 2021 report, tackling precisely the issue of violence against journalists and politicians. I believe we will now hear more about it from Dr. Fry herself. The floor is yours. Please just unmute yourself, Dr. Fry.
You were automatically unmuting me. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's morning here, as Roberto pointed out. But before I begin, I just wanted to thank Margareta Sederfeld for sending her message from Turkey. She has always been a very strong ally in ensuring gender equality and in moving things forward for women and for violence against women, etc. But without Roberto as our Secretary General, none of this would move forward. He has been a real champion. He has actually, as we say in Canada, he's actually put his money where his mouth is. So he has always supported us verbally, but he has also done so in so very many ways. And this is a good example of how he has actually is moving forward the agenda, making changes within the Secretariat itself, making changes within the OSCE EPA in terms of moving women into positions of decision making. So thank you, Roberto, for all the work that you do to support the work that we try to do here. Now, violence against women has been there since time immemorial. I don't need to say that. But violence against women journalists and women in parliament has been increased over the last 10 years. And I think that this is why we call it a crisis, because it's actually increasing. It hasn't remained static. I know that while we struggle to bring more and more women into parliament, the actual threat to women parliamentarians, the actual fear that many of them feel, stops them or prevents a lot of women from wanting to run. And I think that's the overall objective of those who continue to invoke fear and threats and hate against female parliamentarians. It's let's not get these women to run anymore. And yet we know that inherent to democracy is going to be a diverse parliament, parliaments that represent the demographics of their nation states. Over 50% of women actually fill the demographic of most of the nation states in the OSCE PA. So if we're going to have democratic voices, we're going to have women there. And we know about the intersectionality of women, that women are not only targeted in terms of violence against women and women parliamentarians just because they are women, but they're also targeted because of the intersectionality. They're indigenous women, whether they are women from the LGBTQ community, whether they are racialized women. These women are targeted, minority women especially. But I think one of the things that has moved forward to make this a real problem for us is to look at the broader social context. There are many things going on right now. There's a backsliding and a disregard of democratic safeguards in many countries within the OSCE PA. There has been the transition in terms of journalism from ordinary traditional media to new forms of media. Then there is a growing power of community-driven platforms in conveying information. And more recently, we've seen that COVID, the human, economic, and social impact of COVID have also put women on the forefront, and female parliamentarians, women parliamentarians have been speaking out about these things. We also know that women journalists are reporting issues that many people don't report. They report these kinds of issues about how the impact of COVID on women. They report on the social and the democratic problems that are being faced in very many nation states. They are influencers. Their voices matter because they speak to the public and they are able to give information to the public to counteract the disinformation that sadly occurs quite often on social media. But what I want to point out is what should worry us a great deal is that this violence against female parliamentarians and female journalists are not just because done by random people out there in the great unknown in social media. They're not just done by individuals. They are done by special interest groups, by organized groups that wish to decrease women's role in parliament and women's role in influence in journalism. And so I think these are things that we need to remember. And one of these are state actors. I think it's sad to know that many state actors have been actually the ones who have been imposing legislative, not fixing the legislation in terms of changing hate against women in parliament, that our male colleagues may need to step up a lot more and protect their female colleagues in parliament. I think these are important things to think about. But let me just tell you why we call it a crisis. Here's some statistical data here. We've seen, for instance, in 2020, the International Center for Journalists and UNESCO have done a survey that tells us that 73% of female journalists have experienced online hate, violence, and threats. 20% have been abused in person confronted in person who have also been having these threats online. Reporters Without Borders tell us that, that in fact, in the last year, while we know that journalists in general have been under attack from many state actors and non-state actors, the problem is that the number of women-directed hate against journalists has increased, and the number of detention of women journalists by states have increased by 38%. I think that's a startling number to know that women are being singled out by their own states. And again, we have to ask ourselves about democracy and democratic principles. That is a huge amount to know that in the last year, we have had that increase of detention by state authorities that has risen by 35%, targeting women alone. That 29% of women journalists are thinking of leaving the profession. 30% of them say that they do not report on certain topics and certain issues because of fear that that would make them a target. So what we're seeing is that dampening of the freedom of media, the freedom of the ability for journalists to be able to speak truth to power, to be able to show the public what is going on so people can make informed decisions. That is a source of great concern for many of us, because we need to counteract that fake and false information. In terms of women parliamentarians, we've seen that in 2015, there was a survey with IPU, the International Parliamentary Union, by the Council of Europe that said 47% of women parliamentarians faced death threats and threats of rape and beating and threats to their families. 59% have been targets of online hate and sexism on social media. 68% of the hate directed at women parliamentarians aren't necessarily directed at their policies, at the positions they're taking on issues, but it's directed at their physical appearance. It's directed at gender stereotyping. It tends to denigrate. And the whole idea, I want to say, my dear colleagues, is that this is about denigrating the voices, the influential voices of women in these two spheres. The influence of women journalists and the influence of women parliamentarians. I could go on and give you the list of all of the people. We know that there have been women journalists who are in jail right now. We know that there are women parliamentarians who have been killed and murdered in the United Kingdom. We've seen the shooting in the United States. We've seen the attacks on outspoken women like Ocasio-Cortez in the United States, who get harassed by her own colleagues on the floor of Parliament. These are things that should bother us if we care about democracy. So I don't want to go on too much because you received my report in summer of 2021, and I hope you all read it before you came to this meeting. But what I wanted to talk a little bit about is how do we do something? I think we talk a lot. I mean, I have been speaking now about, gender issues for as long as I can remember. And yet think the rate of change is moving very slowly. And I think we need to ask ourselves why it's moving so slowly. And I need to appeal to all of you who are on this, who are both parliamentarians and the ones who speak for journalists that are here today, to say that we need to actually ask ourselves some very important questions. In what ways can the OSCE participating states, including their parliaments and through their parliaments, support women politicians and journalists and tackle the rising rates of gender violence against them? How can the role of parliamentarians of OSCE participating states and the OSCE be enhanced to better support women politicians and journalists who are facing violence in their region and beyond? And how can parliamentarians leverage their power and their abilities to respond to the growing rates of this kind of violence? So I want you to say, what can we as parliamentarians do? What can we, the journalism international organizations do. I know there's been a lot of work done by people like Teresa to move this issue forward, but I think we need to talk about how we as parliamentarians use our power. We have the power to legislate. We have the power to look at hate crimes based on gender against journalists specifically and female parliamentarians. We have the power as parliamentarians to form independent groups that look at the issue, that flag this issue. I must say that Canada, I'm proud to say, is one of the first countries to bring about legislation, to bring about policies that in fact deal with protection of women parliamentarians and that are moving forward to deal with protection of women journalists in our country. They're concrete measures. And I'm asking you, when you speak and you intervene, to talk about the kind of concrete measures that we can take, to talk about how you use your power as legislators, you use your power to speak to the public, you use your power to speak to your constituents, you use the power to fund civil society and to fund organizations that are going to take steps to prevent and to stop this kind of violence, and to use your voices to spread the word to your communities that this violence is occurring and that the threat to democracy is the single most important thing we need to fear. So I'll end there and I'll let us move on to getting our panelists, because we have some I want to thank the panelists for agreeing to appear. And I know that we're going to hear from expert panelists who are going to tell us what they found, what they see, and what they think we should be doing to deal with this crisis at this moment. Thank you very much for listening. Anna?
Thank you, Dr. Fry, for these inspiring words, as they always are, and for highlighting that it's the concrete steps that should be taken to address this issue in an appropriate manner. Statistics that you mentioned are really quite worrying, and I couldn't agree more that we need to sort of re-energize, inspire, and mobilize ourselves to go beyond the boundaries of the business as usual mentality. This, I believe, is so much needed in today's challenging environment. Dear participants, we will now hear from 4 expert speakers who will shed light on main challenges in addressing violence against women journalists and politicians today, as well as their views and examples on how the powers Dr. Fry has mentioned, the powers of policymakers, can contribute to successfully addressing this negative phenomenon. The first speaker is Ms. Teresa Ribeiro, the 5th OSCE representative on freedom of the media. Ms. Ribeiro has vast political, diplomatic, human rights, and media experience. Prior to this position, she was Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Portugal, while serving as President of the National Commission for Human Rights. Throughout her career, Ms. Ribeiro has held different positions in media, both in Portugal and in multilateral organizations, which is why we're particularly looking forward to listening to her presentation and her firsthand experience in dealing with the issue of violence against journalists. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And let me, first of all, thank you all for this very kind invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and to share with all of you the work we are doing regarding online harassment on female journalists. We very much value the work we are doing. And thank you, Dr. Heidi Friday, for your urgent call on the need to take action to really change the situation we have nowadays. Today's dialogue in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and focus on women in the public sphere is important, as journalists and politicians regularly face the same types of attacks and threats. This worrying trend contradicts the plurality of voices and public access to diverse information that we urgently need for democracy, public and parliamentarian debates. And once again, let me take this opportunity to congratulate the Special Representative on Gender Issues, Dr. Eddie Fry, on an excellent report, which clearly illustrates the challenges women in the public sphere face and the need to design and adopt human rights compliant, gender-sensitive policies. I'm thankful for the exchange our offices had prior to its publication and the cooperation that I'm sure will follow from today's event. Gender-based violence in the political and media field has a dramatic impact on public interest activities as it creates a climate of fear and self-censorship. If women's free speech is weakened by physical violence or online threats, this automatically weakens women's participation in any other public role. All too often, the reaction to online violence remains weak and impunity prevails. We need to be aware that online violence and threats are real. There is nothing virtual in online violence. Journalists have always been targeted for their investigations and reporting. Women journalists, however, are targeted not only for what they do, but also for who they are in a very gendered and sexual manner. This has severe chilling effects on free speech and media pluralism, and is linked to the broader discussion on gender equality, women's journalists' access to decision-making positions, the portrayal and stereotyping of women in the media, the digital divide, and unequal power relation in the media and society. Crucial issues parliaments all over OSCE region are engaged in addressing. Last year's global study by the International Center for Journalists and UNESCO confirmed the trends we have witnessed across the OSCE region. Almost 2/3 of the women journalists have experienced online violence related to their job. Gendered hate speech and attacks against journalists, including disinformation, often intersects with race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and so on. A big data analysis of the severe online attacks Nobel Prize laureate Maria Ressa received highlights the network misogyny and attempts to silence her investigates while dismantling trust in facts and independent media, and the links between online attacks and disinformation. But for media to fulfill its crucial role in society, it needs to be trusted. And trust requires that media is a reflection of society and provides different perspectives and insights. Without a plurality of voices and opinions in the media cannot play its contributor and watchdog role in democracy. The same is true for parliamentary representation. Since 2015, my office has been working on the safety of female journalists online, SOFTJO. In Milan in 2018, the OSCE participating states expressed concern for the increased targeted campaigns undermining journalism, eroding public trust, and risking the safety of journalists. Participating states also committed themselves to add the gender perspective to the safety of journalists, recognizing that all of society loses if women journalists are targeted and their unique perspectives are silenced. While such international commitments are important, they alone are not sufficient. We need to address the implementation gap, and parliaments play an essential role in this regard. To assist and provide guidance, my office published a SOFTJO resource guide with 40 proposed actions for 10 key actors to improve the digital safety of women journalists, which should empower, all women in the public sphere and promote plurality. The resource guide does not only propose to review and when necessary, amend or adopt laws to promote a gender-responsive approach to the safety of journalists. It also requires that these processes involve extensive consultations with the media sector and civil society organizations. The same should apply to other reform processes, including the law enforcement. It's equally crucial that legislation addressing online harassment and abuse against female journalists does not undermine the right to freedom of expression. There must be no trade-off to free speech for being safe from online violence. My office is, of course, available to provide expert support to this end. When we look at the perpetrators of online attacks against journalists, unfortunately, and this was also mentioned by Dr. Eddie Fry, threats are regularly coming from high-level politicians and parliamentarians. Misleading, hateful, or harmful speech by public figures is more persuasive and impactful, and it spreads intolerance and divisiveness, denies facts, erodes trust, and creates an environment conducive to abuse by others.
Ms. Ribeiro, could you unmute yourself? We lost you for a moment.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
It's just the last 10 seconds.
Okay, thank you very much. Politicians have a particular responsibility, even duty, to refrain from attacking the media and also to condemn attacks and ensure swift and proper investigations. Politicians should be respectful and promote tolerance, not hate. This was also the thematic of this year's joint declaration by the media freedom and free speech mandate holders. We felt compelled to denounce the rising tide of dangerous, hateful public statements coming from some politicians and public officials. Social media can be a powerful ally of such speech. Digital technologies can empower public participation, but also enable new forms of violence that can be lucrative in the context of advertising-centric business models that prioritize sensational, deceptive, and hateful content over diversity and accuracy. Also, Maria Ressa stated that it's not a coincidence that divisive leaders perform best on social media. Moderating or censoring politicians' speech online can be tricky, especially from the viewpoint of government transparency and accountability to the public. But we need more meaningful transparency around the decisions taken by social media platforms. These powerful companies shape and arbitrate political and public discourse. With such power must come responsibility and accountability, ensured through regulation, self-regulation that safeguards free speech. Parliamentarians can leverage their powers as legislators, push governments to adopt better regulation, and make use of their essential scrutiny function. National action plans for safety of journalists can be a very important tool in this regard, as also recognized in the Milan Ministerial Council decision. The last 2 days I was in Switzerland, where I also discussed with the authorities the development of such a national action plan, which can be the right framework to address a more gender-responsive prevention and protection measures for journalists. To conclude, let me just underline that both our soft jaw resource guide and the PA report provide guidance and good practice examples how parliamentarians can lead efforts to ensure better protection against gender-based violence and empower journalists from diverse backgrounds and experiences. I'm convinced that today's event will lead to further cooperation on this issue. We hope to work together with all of you on tackling gender-based online abuse and to improve national protection and prevention mechanisms for journalists in order to ensure room for diverse and pluralistic public and political debate and safer online environment for the sake of all of us and of our democratic societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Ribeiro, for this detailed and informative presentation and for also pointing out some concrete examples on how parliamentarians can contribute to the global fight against violence against journalists, both women and men. I believe your colleague Julia Haas has just shared the link to the RFOM SOFJO resource guide on our chat, so everyone can access it and look at it. At the end, I would like to say that PA highly values your work and the work of your team, and we're truly looking forward to cooperating with you further on this issue. Our next speaker comes from academic community. Professor Mona-Lena Kruk is professor of political science and chair of the Women and Politics PhD program at Rutgers University. Previously, she was an assistant professor of political science and women, gender, and sexuality studies at Washington University and St. Louis. Her current research explores the global diffusion and impact of electoral quotas for women, as well as the rising global phenomenon of violence against women in politics. Finally, her work on violence against women in politics grew out of this research and actually explores mechanisms of resistance and backlash towards women's greater inclusion in the political sphere. As mentioned before, our members of parliament always highly value the inputs from the experts in the field, and they can truly help legislative and policy-making processes. We're looking forward now to hearing your observations on this topic. You have the floor, Professor Kruk.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. So I think you can see it. Okay, so thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this panel. Last year, I published a book entitled Violence Against Women in Politics, which was inspired by work that I've been doing over the last, say, 7 years with politicians, international organizations, and NGOs around the world. So this is really a book that was written for academics, but also for policymakers. And I'll just note that the cover of the book has a lot of hashtags. It includes the SOFJO safety of female journalists online, which Teresa just mentioned. Okay, so in the book, I look at these 4 questions. So first, I try to understand where this concept of violence against women in politics came from, right? How did political women around the world come to name this, their experiences in this way? Second, how is it different from other forms of violence in politics? Third, what does violence against women in politics look like around the world? What are the forms it takes? And finally, what can be done to address it? And why does it matter that we do? So in this short presentation, I'll just talk mainly about the second and third questions, but also say a few things at the end about the fourth as well. Before I do that, though, I think it's probably a good idea just to clarify what I mean by the key terms violence and women in politics. I think for many people, violence refers exclusively to the use of physical force. And some scholars have talked about this as a minimalist definition of violence, which privileges the perpetrator of violence and focuses on an act that takes place at a discrete moment in time, right? So with a clearly identifiable beginning and end. In contrast, more comprehensive definitions understand violence as a violation, and specifically a violation of integrity in the sense of the wholeness or intactness of the self, right? So from this perspective, a person's physical integrity could be violated, but also their mental and emotional integrity as well. And this approach shifts the focus to targets and their experiences of violence, pointing out that violent acts can have ripple effects that can affect the target as well as members of their families and their communities for years to come. And this is very much in line with how women's rights activists think about gender-based violence, which they argue exists along a spectrum or a continuum where different acts tap into the same phenomenon, but also interact with and bolster one another. So the classic example here on the right is of the iceberg, right? So where the visible physical acts are just the tip, but there's a large range of other acts like gendered insults and sexual harassment, which form a large mass under the surface. In terms of women in politics, a lot of my early work focused on female politicians, but over the course of writing my book, I realized this is really an issue about women's political participation more broadly, right? The right of women to participate in political and public life. So for me, it's really, I think, important to look like we are in this event at women serving in a variety of political roles. And so from this UN General Assembly resolution, you can see that actually the international discussion is starting to connect these parallel campaigns that have developed over the last few years, looking at violence against female politicians, violence against women human rights defenders, and violence against women journalists. But my definition would also add women as voters, party members, election officials, and even staffers and interns, among other possibilities. Okay, so just in terms of a theoretical framework, in the book, and I think this is helpful, and I think this helps elaborate what Dr. Fry mentioned in her opening remarks, is that I think it's important to distinguish between violence in politics and violence against women in politics. So violence in politics is how political violence has traditionally been understood as being directed at political opponents, right? So in a sense, it's issue-based. It's about implementing your policy vision rather than the other side's. And this is a form of violence that affects both men and women and tends to be higher in contexts where there's greater impunity for violence, and also places where the state capacity to enforce the law is relatively low. This form of violence can take some gendered forms, for example, with the use of sexual violence against female supporters of another party. The democratic costs of this type of violence are widely recognized because one side is getting its way through force and intimidation rather than through fair democratic elections. In contrast, violence against women in politics is identity-based. So it specifically targets women driven by patriarchal imperatives, namely the idea that politics is a male space and that women therefore must be kept out. It can take some gendered forms like sexual violence, but it can also take non-gendered forms like political assassinations, for example. And the democratic costs of this form of violence, I argue, are not yet well recognized. And I think this is for a few reasons. I mean, first, patterns of violence against women are highly normalized in many societies, right? So these acts don't really seem to be out of the ordinary, so we don't tend to attract much attention. Second, I think there's often a tendency to equate acts of violence against women in politics with ordinary violence in political spaces, right? So as a result, acts that are identity-based are framed as instead being issue-based, right? And then somehow more acceptable or understandable. Finally, most politically active women experience both forms of violence, right? Sometimes at different moments in time and sometimes at the same moment. But I still think it's important to try to recognize that there are these two dimensions, even if it's hard to sort of disentangle them in practice. So data from a UN women's study on violence against politically active women in India, Pakistan, and Nepal provides some evidence for this distinction. So you can see here that the largest share of perpetrators in India were political rivals, But across the three countries, the most common perpetrators are members of women's own political parties and members of their own families. And this finding is surprising if we only understand political violence as being issue-based. It's not surprising if we draw on insights from work on gender-based violence, which shows that women are most likely to experience violence at the hands of people that they know. Talking about violence against women in politics, of course, doesn't necessarily mean that gender is the only salient identity. In my interviews and in the emerging research in this area, we see that younger women, women of color, for example, seem to face even higher levels of abuse. But again, this isn't surprising because the violence against women in politics framework suggests that women are attacked because they're not seen as rightful participants in political spaces, right? So this is an insight that should hold also for people who challenge the status quo in other ways as well, right? So people who don't look like the typical older white male politician. Turning to what this violence looks like in practice, most practitioners focus on 4 types of violence that are widely recognized in international conventions as well as domestic legislation, namely physical, sexual, psychological, and economic violence. And so this is a table from the first global study by the Interparliamentary Union. And I think there's a lot of things that are very interesting about this data, but I think it really highlights the importance of taking or recognizing a broader spectrum of violence, right? So here you can see that around 25% of women in the study said they had experienced physical violence in the course of their work as parliamentarians. However, more than 80% said they'd experienced some form of psychological violence, while around 1/3 had experienced economic violence and around 20% had experienced sexual violence. So only focusing on the physical forms doesn't allow us to accurately capture what women are actually experiencing on the ground, including the widespread nature of psychological abuse. So in my book, I go on to give examples of these 4 types of violence using cases from both the global north and the global south. So just give you a few examples, right? So physical violence, I think it's the most intuitive to understand. Can include things like murders, kidnappings, beatings, as well as arbitrary detention. Psychological violence often involves death and rape threats, intimidation, stalking, but maybe the most common type is online harassment. Sexual violence can include things like rape, sexual harassment, sexualized threats. And it's really, I think, been the most difficult for women to speak up about. But of course, the Me Too movement has made this a bit easier in recent years. Economic violence finally refers to using access to economic resources as a form of intimidation or control. So it could involve things like destroying women's campaign materials, vandalizing their offices and their homes, and ruining their livelihoods, right? Making it difficult or impossible to continue their political work. To these standard 4 types, I add a 5th category that I call semiotic violence, which I think isn't captured by that existing typology. And it involves using words and images to degrade and delegitimize women as political leaders, primarily for a larger public. So this could include photoshopped images depicting women in sexually graphic and humiliating ways, fake sex tapes released during elections, and deepfake videos portraying women in false and misleading ways. And semiotic violence has characterized portrayals of women in public life throughout history, but it's really gained new life in recent years with rising gender disinformation campaigns around the world. Okay, finally, in terms of solutions, we, as has been mentioned by other colleagues, we've seen rising efforts around the world to address violence against women in politics over the last 5 years. And so I'll just show you a couple of images of a few of these strategies. So the first is awareness raising, often by female politicians talking about their experiences, as well as NGOs. I've been very involved from the beginning with the National Democratic Institute's Not the Cost campaign, And the hashtag is to argue that this isn't just the cost of doing politics for women, right? We need to say this isn't right. We need to say this is not the cost. Another set of strategies are global and state-led strategies focused on developing international frameworks, as well as national legislation on this issue. I think the leading region here is Latin America when it comes to producing laws. But for example, in Europe, we see Parliament of Catalonia recently passed a reform to their law on violence against women to recognize violence against women in politics. We also see parliamentary initiatives to address the safety of parliamentarians, including codes of conduct regarding sexual harassment. And finally, we see some society-led strategies to try to collect women's stories and to try to create a safer environment for women's political participation, both online and offline. And I'll just close with a couple of resources that I created as a companion to my book. It's just a Twitter account and a website with all the latest news and research, both by academics and by policymakers, international organizations on violence against women in politics. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Crook, for this thought-provoking presentation and important overview of different forms of violence, as well as concrete proposals regarding a call to action. I think we can all agree that having a clear understanding of different forms of violence is an essential step to be able to take any action in dealing with this important issue. And I'm sure our participants will follow with many questions during the debate. Our third speaker, Mr. Sasha Gavric, facilitates the work of OSCE Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights on gender equality in political life and on governmental institutional mechanisms on the advancement of women. Before joining ODIHR, Mr. Gavric was working as the mission's gender advisor of the OSCE mission in Kosovo and a team leader in Skopje, North Macedonia. He is passionate advocate and agent of change with 15 years of experience in cultural diplomacy, human and minority rights, gender equality, and democratic governance in civil society organizations, bilateral agencies, and international organizations. Dear Sasha, you have the floor.
Thank you, Hannah. Dear ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to be with you today at this event. I'm sending you warm regards from Warsaw, from the OSCE Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. A special thank you to the Special Representative, Dr. Fry, for her immense leadership. It is lovely to continue working together in the broader area of women's political participation and gender equality in politics. My today's intervention will focus on parliaments and will be a call in a way to for a renewed commitment to the gender-sensitive parliaments approach as a tool for organizational change and as a tool to which helps to change organizational culture and in that way to address violence against women in politics. I will start my presentation with 3 points. The first point is a reminder about the fact that we have experienced an incredible increase of women's presence in OSCE parliaments. When we go back to 1995, the year when the Beijing conference, the 4th global conference on the status of women took place in Beijing, we would see that only 11% in average of MPs were female. Luckily, this figure has almost tripled, and today we are at an average of 29% in the OSCE region. What we have learned over the time, and that's my second point, is also that women's presence in parliaments doesn't automatically mean change in organizational culture. This is why we still see that by becoming members of the parliament, women do indeed experience an increased number of cases that are part of the broader understanding of violence against women in politics, as dear Professor Crook has been has introduced to us. What we have also experienced, and Professor Dr. Fry has referred to that, is an incredible gender backlash. So whatever we have achieved in the last 3 decades in a lot of countries around the OSCE region, it's being questioned at the moment, and women's rights and gender equality overall are being questioned by diverse conservative movements in different countries, but also cross-nationally. I will introduce you also shortly to 2 data sets that were collected this year as part of an ODIHR research that was looking into practices on gender-sensitive parliaments. We're very happy that the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly has supported us in this data collection. And out of the 56 states that were contacted, 46 OSCE participating states have come back to us with their responses. And without now the need to go into details and to analyze every bulk in this slide, you will easily conclude that the first bulk is the biggest one in all 3 categories, and that it goes beyond 70%. And this data, in fact, represents that parliaments in 70% of cases in the OSCE region that responded to our service, unfortunately, were not taking any measures that are related to awareness raising, training, but also to sexual harassment codes and behavioral codes. So the majority of OSCE parliaments reported to us in our survey not taking any action in addressing violence against women in the parliaments, being that those violence is addressed against female MPs or female parliamentary staff. Within the same survey, we have also looked on what parliaments are doing when it comes to overall gender mainstreaming efforts, being it gender mainstreaming training, but also adopting gender equality action plans and overall gender equality policies. And here again, you will see that the significant majority, and again, over 70%, and in the case of training, even over 90% of parliaments reported back to us that unfortunately no actions are taken in order to promote gender equality and mainstream gender within the parliaments. This data, but also other data sets, will be soon published in the new ODIHR guide on gender-sensitive parliaments that will come out in the first quarter of 2022. Nevertheless, I would like to remind us that, of course, our overall goal is to make parliaments deliver for all women and men, boys and girls, in all their diversity. And in order to do so, parliaments are promoting, and states are promoting, gender parity in representation, and are taking different measures to address the barriers to women's political participation, recognizing violence against women in politics as one of the barriers. We at ODIHR believe that a tool that can be used in order to address the issue of gender equality, gender parity, and violence against women in politics is, of course, the tool of gender-sensitive parliaments. ODIHR has joined a global community of stakeholders that are working with gender-sensitive approaches and gender-sensitive parliament approaches. We believe that a gender-sensitive parliament, if gender-sensitive parliaments are being piloted and implemented in the parliament, will be able to address the needs and interests of all women and men in its structure, methods, and work. Automatically, in a way linked to this, we also believe that gender-sensitive parliaments will foster a gender-sensitive organizational culture that will be free of violence and discrimination. Related to that, we would like to candidate a proposal of 6 actions, 6 basic steps that we find important if we want to promote gender equality systematically in parliaments. The first step is to ensure political will and leadership commitment in the parliaments for gender equality as an overall strategic goal for the parliament itself. Parliaments need to serve as a role model for the broader society, and in that sense, they also need to make sure that they lead gender equality processes in a society. In order to be able to understand the current gender equality situation, and that brings me to the second point, parliaments should undertake gender audits, systematic reviews or assessments on the lessons learned, the achievements, but also on the shortcomings when it comes to mainstreaming gender in the 3 parliamentary functions, being it representation, lawmaking, and oversight, but also when it comes to the issue of how women and men in all their diversities can contribute free of violence and discrimination to the parliamentary work. Once such an audit is conducted, we believe that the parliament will have enough information in order to have a full commitment and going into the direction of developing and adopting a parliamentary gender action plan. Even though there's a lot of criticism towards strategic documents like action plans or strategies, especially when it comes to their implementation, we still believe that there was no better way discovered on how inequality in parliaments can be tackled. And this is why parliaments should have their gender action plan independently on the activities that might be taken by the government and diverse government ministries and agencies. A very important step, and that leads to the point 4, is the awareness raising and capacity building of MPs and staff. We believe that parliaments need to take independent action, especially after every election, in raising the awareness of their members of the parliament, but also of the parliamentary staff that are present there, in order not to be just able, of course, to mainstream gender, let's say in lawmaking or in oversight activities, but also to be able to recognize inequality, violence, and gender-based discrimination, and to potentially report or tackle it in diverse forms. What we have learned also from very diverse parliaments, and that's the point 5, is the need for evidence-based data. We call upon parliaments in the OSCE region to conduct research on violence against women in politics in the parliaments themselves. Parliaments ideally would outsource and commission a research on the topic in order to understand what the current situation when it comes to violence against women in politics is within the parliamentary structure, including research that will cover also female staffers, as those are a cornerstone also together with male staffers of the parliamentary life. And finally, the 6th point is, of course, to look, review, and potentially amend policies, structures, and mechanisms. Professor Crook was referring to a code of conduct. I would be happy also later, maybe in discussion, to say a few more words on that, as we really believe that result-oriented code of conduct with independent reporting mechanisms will create a culture of will create a culture within the organization that violence will not be tolerated, and that the victim, potential victim, is at the center of such policies. ODIHR stays available to the OSCE participating states and the parliaments to support activities on the ground. We have done, for example, just this and last year, research on violence against women in politics in Serbia, Poland, and Kyrgyzstan. At the beginning of next year, we plan to publish a targeted violence against Violence Against Women in Politics toolkit that will be hopefully out already in the first or second quarter of the next year. But we also stay available to support the review of legislation, code of conduct, and rules of procedures, not just from a gender perspective, but also specifically when it comes to sexual harassment and all forms of gender-based discrimination and violence. And we are there for the Parliament to support capacity building and awareness raising activities on violence against women in politics. Thank you a lot. And dear Hannah, I stay available later on to answer any questions. And as said, also to say maybe a few additional words on code of conduct or the importance of code of conduct within the Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Sasha, for this detailed and informative presentation, and for also outlining concrete mechanisms that the parliaments can apply in order to become gender sensitive. I think we're all looking forward to your guide on gender sensitive parliaments, which we will also happily distribute to all our members, of course. I know that you have authored and co-authored numerous books, articles, volumes, and so on that are focusing on actually gender equality and women's representation and democratic institutions. And it is always a pleasure to listen to you. And I think you are a living example that it is crucial to bring in men as integral partners and engage them in really all initiatives and actions in this regard. Thank you again. Our last speaker is Ms. Rumbijay Kandavasvikanundu, Senior Advisor for Democracy and Inclusion at International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. She has an impressive career as a democracy and gender equality advocate and practitioner with several years of responsible engagement in the political participation and representation areas on gender equality and women's empowerment, political systems, parties, electoral systems and processes, and so on. We are particularly looking forward to hearing this presentation, Ms. Kandavasvikanundu, as you have a vast experience in gender mainstreaming in lawmaking processes and in representation and oversight functions by members of parliament specifically. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator, and greetings, everyone. On behalf of International IDEA, allow me also to express our gratitude to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly for affording us this opportunity to engage in a very critical and yet sometimes overlooked and even trivialized issue that has a profound effect on democracy building worldwide. So whether we are talking about democracy building in relation to electoral processes, political parties, how political parties function and are structured, we realize that gender-based violence, and in particular, violence against women in politics and violence against women journalists or women in the media, is becoming a perennial problem and a challenge. As International IDEA, and building on some of the aspects that the previous speakers have highlighted, and in particular, I note what Dr. Fry was saying in her introductory remarks with regards to what ways should we put in place, what needs to be done. And Mona has given us the conceptual framework and the examples of understanding the complexity of the issue at hand. I would like to, first of all, highlight the very fact that in order to come up with ways and effective ways, because we have some examples that we've mentioned of interventions on addressing issues of violence against women in politics and violence against women journalists. But at the same time, Dr. Fry was saying these measures or ways don't seem to be effective. There is still some level of tolerance that it's okay in society to have violence. And this is violence broadly in politics. And then of course, how then it manifests, particularly with regards to women and with regards to women journalists. Why is this a problem, really? We need to acknowledge the very fact that it's a silencing strategy. It's a silencing strategy, not just to the individual woman, but to women as a group. And why is it a silencing strategy? And why is it manifesting so much in these two spheres, public spheres, politics and the media? We know for sure that politics, the public sphere in terms of politics, be it in parliament, be it in political parties, be it in any initiatives related to electoral processes, it's about power and decision-making and influence. So we need to also think of ways or be innovative in terms of the way, large extent, tract and equal in our relations, patriarchal model.
Ms. Kandavasvikanundu, for some reason we are having issues in hearing you. Could you maybe try turning off your camera and speaking? We lost about 20 seconds.
Okay, is it better now?
Yes, much better, thank you.
Video just to stabilize.
Thank you.
I was that in order for us to sustain measures and ways of women in politics, women in the media, or women journalists per se, we need also to deconstruct and unpack the underlying factors, which is essentially the patriarchal models and patriarchal systems and processes for politics, and the underlying unequal gender power relations. So all our interventions now, for instance, if we speak to parliamentarians per se, in relation to their responsibilities on lawmaking, representation, and oversight, we know the laws on their own, they are not going to be enough. They are not going to change. They can inform and create an enabling environment for enforcement and maybe for compliance, and mostly for transformative mindsets. Because violence against women in politics and violence against women in the media is entrenched and perpetuated by mindsets. The mindsets which are informed by the norms and roles, that gender roles and norms, that public spaces, the public sphere is the male terrain. And therefore, when women come in as journalists and women come in as politicians, they are interfering. That's why in a number of instances, when there's advocacy work on increasing women's political participation and representation and increasing women's presence and participation in the media, there are tokenism language that is used, that we are giving women a quota to be in parliament. We are giving them this opportunity to be in parliament. It's being seen as a benevolent gift, not as a democratic imperative and not as a democratic right for women to be in those spaces. So as long as in parliaments, in society at large, and in the media, the narratives and the messages still are based on benevolent giving women and not understanding it as a democratic right and imperative, all our efforts, in as much as, of course, they create some inroads, they will remain very constrained and limited in terms of effectiveness. So what does it mean? We are identifying it's a silencing strategy Why? Because the voices that become predominant now in politics will be essentially male. And this is the bottom line that we need to address, because for us to eradicate and eliminate all forms of violence against women in politics, against women generally, against women in the media, we need to ensure that the perceptions towards what is leadership and what informs political leadership are changed. And without that transformation of mindsets, we'll still be realizing that our efforts can remain limited. I would like to emphasize an approach and some efforts that we can invest in, which I'll call access, participation, representation, and transformation interventions. We know it's about silencing, it's about making sure that women cannot have access into these public spheres or spaces that inform and direct what happens nationally and globally. So at a parliamentary level, what measures can be put in place to ensure that women's access, the abilities and opportunities to get and to enter into politics, into media, as the voices is facilitated? So we can talk, for instance, and give examples of the law. That would be one measure for opening the spaces and access. But at the same time, what about the participation? When women are in these spaces, if we see the findings and the results that come from the Interparliamentary Union, for instance, or the statistics that Sasa was giving, or the research that Mona has provided, has done over the years, or what Madame Therese spoke about, the examples, when women are in these spaces, still their participation, effective participation, is encountering several barriers: the harassment, the abuse in the various forms that it has been described, whether it's online, it's physical. So what other measures, if we provide laws, we need to then say, to what extent are these laws deconstructing the elephants that are in the room that prevent meaningful participation? Because to participate is one thing, and then also to be having a voice and influence, effective representation is another. So all our interventions, measures or mechanisms, or whatever we want to call them, whether they are legal, whether they are in terms of social awareness raising and consciousness raising and transformative agenda setting policies, they have to deal with the issue of participation and representation. Because to get into a space, to be in the media, to be in parliament, for instance, it's not adequate. What is the enabling environment? What is that context? And how do we make sure our measures and interventions not just provide a legal framework, but they cascade to impact on the environments where this, or the spaces where participation and representation is supposed to occur, even if it's at the local government level, in local councils. We're talking here about the parliamentary level, for instance, and the media in different levels. But a lot of women also are inhibited from their participation at the local government level, the communities where their lives are anchored and a lot of issues that affect their day-to-day lives are decided on. Having dealt with the pillar of access, participation, and representation, we need ways and measures that then transform these spaces. And by transformation, it means really addressing the unequal power relations, the redistribution of power. because violence against women in politics and violence against women in the media, it's essentially an issue of exercising power over women. So if we understand the notions and dynamics of exercising power over others, we need then to say, how does this law, the mechanisms that we've put in place, deal with the issue of transformation in order to transform not just the environment or the public space, whether it's parliament, local council, or it's in the media, but how does it transform the mindsets of societies and the redistribution of power? Because that is what drives the patriarchal system, which perpetuates violence against women in politics and violence against women in the media. Lastly, I would like to highlight the example, for instance, of the legislative framework that Bolivia has put in place. And this is a law that criminalizes violence against women in politics. And the same essence, it can also inspire violence against women in the media, violence against women in the different public spheres and in the private sphere as well. But underlying the fact of implementation, to what extent such a critical legislative framework, to what extent is it fully implemented in order to transform the notion of an equal gender power relations, which drives and perpetuates violence against women in politics and violence against women in the media. So indeed, legislation is needed, but how then also do parliamentarians, in light of their responsibility on representation and oversight, what are they doing to communicate, to represent, and to provide messaging constantly that show that violence against women in politics and violence against women in the media is not tolerated? And by the way, this representative function by parliaments should not only be demanded or called for from women parliamentarians, because in many instances, when we mention about interventions that should promote gender equality and women's empowerment, there is a default assumption that it's the few women parliamentarians in the world who are essentially a minority in these spaces who should be the voices and the representatives of these issues and putting them on the political agenda. Of course, I'm not saying they should not be the conduits of the change that we would like to see, but we need also to realize that if access, participation, representation, and transformation is going to be meaningful and institutionalized in our institutions that can support democracy building and in society at large, these interventions also need the responsible engagement of both male and female parliamentarians and societies at large. Thank you for your attention, moderator, panelists, and all the participants.
Thank you, dear Ms. Kandavasvikanundu. Thank you for this passionate presentation. You outlined many important things, and it is difficult to choose only a few of them to mention just now. But I would like to say that I think we can all agree that we really do need a whole of society approach, and that is something that we're really trying to promote in the OSCE, to contribute to combating discrimination, harassment, and abuse against women journalists and politicians. And on the other hand, it is highly appreciated that you mentioned the importance of changing mindsets. And it's actually a democratic imperative, as you said, to change mindsets to ensure that women get to meaningfully participate in all their activities. Dear participants, with this we have concluded the presentations from the expert panel. I would like to thank everyone for their interesting observations. Before opening the debate for which I believe we have around half an hour. I would just like to repeat a few rules, that questions, comments, and interventions shall be limited to 3 minutes so that we can enable as many contributions as possible. And I would kindly remind you that participants should request the floor through the chat function on Zoom, and that when given the floor, you can address the experts by unmuting your microphone. Before we start with the debate, I would just like to ask Dr. Fry whether she would like to say anything at this point.
Thank you, Hannah. Yes, I wanted to thank the presenters, and I wanted to, it was interesting to note how they each of them brought a different perspective to things. And I thought Teresa spoke very clearly about the media and about their watchdog role and their being providers of information. And I think this is they need to bring unique perspectives. And I think we talked about the need for that kind of diversity of perspectives in the media. But I think what's even more important is that we need to talk about the fact that the media, or the media that we consider to be a bona fide media, and not just individuals and others on social media. The thing about journalists is that they have a code of conduct themselves, and that they are reliable in terms of the facts that they should give out. They have to be accountable, and they have to have what they say to be verifiable. And that makes them very, very different from people who go online and just say whatever they think, so that they are therefore the keepers of truth and of real information. I think that was important that she brought that up. I think she talked a lot about Parliament looking at creating legislation or regulations that will look at the digital safety of journalists from online violence. And to also that she mentioned threats by parliamentarians themselves on the media that are misleading, hateful, and denigrating. I think, the self-regulation of journalists supported by government legislation is an important thing for parliamentarians to discuss and to look at. I think Professor Crook, of course, gave us a lot of great information, and I'm hoping that we can find out if some of us can get a copy of her book online or buy a copy of her book somehow. So if we can post that to the participants, that would be very helpful. But I think what she brought to the fore is the fact that violence against women in politics and violence against women in general is not simply physical violence, because that's limited to a time and a place, and that therefore that can be forgotten. But I think the fact that the ongoing violence has a spectrum, that it is both physical, sexual, economic violence, and psychological violence, is something that we really need to talk about. And I think it was interesting that she pointed out that violence in politics in general usually is issue-based against parliamentarians per se, and that there is always a democratic cost that everyone understands that comes about with that kind of violence. But when we talk about violence against women in politics, it is usually identity-based and not necessarily. It can be issue-based, but it's nearly always identity-based. It always denigrates the woman, stereotypes her, and threatens her with sexual violence, which I don't see being male politicians being threatened with at all. And I think what she pointed out was that the democratic costs of not having women wanting to run in Parliament is not recognized at all. And I think, her appeal and her plea that we should have parliaments and NGOs continue to raise awareness is an important one. I think Sasha, of course, gave us some interesting information, which makes me think, oh my gosh, we have not gotten very far. When in 1995, there were 11% of female MPs in the region, and in 2021, it's only 29%. That is not good news. As a physician, if that's the kind of outcomes we will get over all those years, it's not considered to be good outcomes. But I think that he pointed out very importantly that this violence against women parliamentarians and against women journalists is a backlash. It's a backlash against the traditional institutions that we've had, against the daring of women to come into these two major power and influencing institutions, and that is a very important piece of violence. I thought his idea that we should have gender-sensitive audits is an interesting one, which could be something that is reported each year to parliaments, not to governments, but to parliaments. And I think the fact that he asked for parliaments to do research on the gender violence amongst MPs and staff is interesting. I know in Canada that we do have a third party to which MPs and staff can report, and then there is a follow-through from an independent group that can allow people to look at the violence. But sometimes people don't speak up. They're afraid to speak up. They don't know what will happen. They don't know if it could get out there and that their names would be out in the public. So a lot of people don't need to. But if we did surveys that asked the specific question, that would be an interesting thing to look at. And I think, of course, the code of conduct, and we have adopted a code of conduct in Canada a few years ago with gender sensitivity training and safety training, et cetera, that was very important. And finally, I wanted to just thank Ms. Kandavasvikanundu for her, again, her interpretation of the fact that I liked that she said that we now look at having women in parliaments and women in journalism, which are two powerful institutions, that it's about the redistribution of power. And this is a backlash to the redistribution of power. How dare women be so uppity as to get into these powerful positions? So let's bring them down and let's take them down and let's make sure they don't want to go there. But I thought she said also an important thing, that we're all giving women power. We are all being so kind as to allow them to come in. And everyone takes credit for this giving power to women and we don't see it as a democratic imperative, but as a nice, benevolent thing to do. I thought that was very interesting. And until we stop looking at it that way, everything we try to do with regard to gender equality is going to be ineffective. So I want to thank them. They all had different things for us to look at. And I think I'd love to hear what interventions say. And I want to thank them very much, because what I like about everybody is that they were concrete. And I think that's really important. I will end here, Hannah, and allow for interventions.
Thank you, Dr. Fry. I believe Professor Crook has also just shared a link to her book on our chat, her book, Violence Against Women in Politics. Thank you for sharing this. And now I will open the debate. I believe the first one on the list is Ms. Irene Charalambidis, the Vice President of the OSCE-PA from Cyprus, who I believe has a vast experience in journalism before becoming a member of parliament. Ms. Charalambidis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hannah. Firstly, I must note that as a former journalist and now as a politician for the last 12 years, I have been a victim of affronts myself. And it was hard to cope with that many times. Because you don't trust even the police when you have to accuse a colleague who belongs to the governmental party, but you feel that you are obliged to do it because women look up to you, and you take the risk to go to people that you might not trust and accuse a colleague of misconduct or of wrong behavior. Therefore, I would like to commend Dr. Hedy Fry for her continuous efforts in promoting gender issues, and specifically for the appeal to act. It is a well-structured document, I must say. It aims at ensuring safer working conditions for all media professionals, free from fear and intimidation, both online and offline, and I hope that her recommendations can be adopted by the OSCE-PA as well as by national parliaments. Secondly, I would like to thank all of the speakers for their truly valuable contributions. I very much hope that the OSCE representative on the freedom of the media, as well as other OSCE officials dealing with violence against women journalists and politicians, will be in closer contact with the PA and with national parliaments when it comes to necessary changes in legislation or the adoption of measures concerning combating the phenomenon of violence against women in politics and journalism. It is undoubted that women journalists face online and offline attacks, putting their safety at risk. They are anyway being targeted on the basis of their work as journalists, and because with their reporting, they uncover human rights violations, corruption, and abuse of power. But they are also the targets of gender-based violence. This violence ranges from stigmatization and sexist hate speech to physical assault and even murder, as we have tragically witnessed. Indeed, violence against women in journalism has a distinct set of negative consequences and needs to be dealt with distinct measures. Women politicians face oftentimes the same challenges: threats, comments relating to their physical appearance or based on gender stereotypes, as well as verbal, psychological, or physical violence, which aims to degrade their personal dignity and harm public perceptions of their suitability for political office. There is now growing recognition by the international community of the need to take into account the specific risks women journalists, politicians, and activists face both offline and online. Women journalists and politicians contribute to the creation of a more pluralistic, inclusive, and gender-balanced democracy. We must not allow that the stories of female journalists and the voices of female politicians be intimidated or silenced. Impunity for crimes against female journalists and politicians needs particular attention. As parliamentarians, we must ensure that social media platforms are vigilant against such attacks and are able to swiftly remove such content as hate speech. Additionally, making sure that legally binding codes of conduct contain, it was said before by the ODIHR representative, so such content as hate speech, we might, sorry for that, but I think I was talking about the code of conduct. All parliaments, we have to introduce specific code of conduct when it comes to women parliamentarians. I mean, when a colleague of ours has no arguments to deal with or face us or confront us, they just attack us in a very degrading way. And you cannot get caught up into this kind of discussion, because next day the newspapers will come out and will not be, I think, respectful to the woman, especially when you live to patriarchal societies like mine. I really do hope that Cyprus one day, sooner than later, I hope, we have presidential selection in 2023, will have a woman president. I think this will change everything in my country. Thank you all for participating today. Thank you, Dr. Fry, for giving us the chance to participate in such discussions. And let's all work in a code of conduct, to form a code of conduct in our parliaments. Thank you so much all. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Ms. Karalambides, for your intervention and also for sharing your personal story. We really appreciate it. Are there any other requests for floor from our members of parliaments? If this is not the case, I would like to ask our four experts to share some concluding words and if possible, put some concrete policy recommendation for our audience of politicians, but really 2 minutes, 2-3 minutes maximum each. I will start in reverse order this time. Ms. Kandavasvikanundu, would you like to add something or respond to the intervention?
Yes, please. Thank you. As I mentioned earlier on, it remains fundamental that we do have the laws in place, but the bigger picture for changes and transformation rests in the processes of transforming mindsets, perceptions, and attitudes. So violence against women is essentially an outcome or a manifestation of the entrenched perceptions and attitudes towards women's leadership and towards male leadership. And it is not going to just disappear by some evolutionary process. There have to be concrete interventions that challenge both women, men, boys, and girls, and other people across the different identities. And ultimately, as I said, it's also important to realize that these two entities that we're focusing on in this particular session, the media and politics, and then situating it to parliament per se, it's the bottom line is power. And everything boils down to the redistribution of power and privileges. And the patriarchal systems and processes that we have are essentially designed to propel male privilege. And those are some of the uncomfortable conversations and issues that need to be constantly raised and placed on the table. Even just listening to the former the speaker, the example, Madam from Cyprus. So laws on their own are not going to be sufficient. They have to be reinforced by ongoing social interventions for a transformative agenda in the long term.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sasha Gavric, would you like to add a couple of words at the end?
Thank you, Hannah. Well, I will be very concrete in my final words, and reaffirming the call from the Vice President of the OSCPA for code of conduct. We at the OSCE believe that code of conduct are indeed a very strong mechanism to address sexual harassment and all forms of gender-based discrimination and violence. We call upon OSCE participating states to do that in an evidence-based development process, that the issues around gender-based violence and intersectionality should be really underpinning principles of such a process. By developing a code of conduct, we call also upon the consultation of experts on gender, and that those experts should support the parliament in a way in understanding the different barriers and core problems that relate to violence against women in politics. It is central to avoid language that will blame victims or the survivor, but it should put into the center of the interest of potential victims and survivors when it comes to the definitions within the code of conduct. Very important, what we have seen is as well that it should be applicable not just to members of parliament, but to all that are working in the parliament. So that includes members of the parliament, but also ministers, political staff, parliamentary staff, and any other parliamentary workers. Within that code of conduct, it is important to establish independent complaint mechanisms so that reporting can take place independently and that it will be handled independently. And very important, linked through the existence of a code of conduct is, of course, some form of a mandatory in-person training for all parliamentary workers, including the members of parliament. We don't believe that trainings are an automatic solution against violence against women, in politics, but indeed awareness-raising activities and training addressing conscious and unconscious issues that relate to gender inequality are really important. And finally, of course, those parliaments that do have code of conduct, they should not sit, so to say, on the achievement, but they should take the opportunity to regularly review their mechanisms, their provisions, and then to make sure that respective codes are being amended and are further developed. OSCE ODIHR, as our dear Vice President of the OSCE PA from Cyprus has mentioned, is one of those institutions that stays available to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and to the OSCE parliaments in working together to address this immense barrier for women's political participation and overall the realization of democratic institutions. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Sasha. Thanks a lot. Professor Crook, would you like to add something?
Sure, yeah. So in my, it was really important for me, even though I'm an academic, to really focus on solutions in the work that I've done. And I would just highlight one of the collaborations that I've had over the years is with the Gender, Women, and Democracy team at the National Democratic Institute. And in 2016, we launched the Not the Cost campaign to stop violence against women in politics. And we issued a global call to action, which identified interventions that actors at different levels could take. So international organizations, governments, parliaments, parties, civil society, media, tech companies, et cetera. And in 2016, all of our suggested solutions were hypothetical, really. There weren't that many concrete examples around the world. This past March, we updated the global call to action, it's a renewed call to action. And it was a very interesting experience because I looked at what had happened over the last 5 years. And actually we had concrete examples for all the things we suggested, plus all the other, many other innovations emerging around the world. And so in my book, I try to give examples of like, here's a solution to physical violence. Here's one to economic violence, right? All these individual types of violence, but then also some of these cross-cutting solutions like legislation that touches on multiple types of violence. So I feel really encouraged that we are seeing many, existing practices already emerging. And I think if we can exchange and share, that can only be a good thing, right? To think about ways of addressing this issue. I think also that shows that really everyone could do something to tackle violence against women in politics, from the ordinary citizen all the way up to the highest level. That said, though, one of the experiences I had while I was writing the book was that solutions to every form of violence really start with awareness raising. I think awareness raising is like that critical first step, right? Because you can't have a solution if you don't recognize that there's a problem, right? And you have to give a name to the problem. You need a language to discuss. And I've been on lots of panels. I've done lots of interviews. And political women say, this is the first time I'm talking about this. I might have been in parliament for 30 years, but this is the first time I'm talking about this, or first time I talk about this publicly. And I think it's just so important that we really work on that too, right? And I'm just really excited about seminars like this one that give us a chance to really, raise this issue and to say, it's not just this inevitable consequence of women's political participation, something we shouldn't accept, is something that we have to name and actively take a stance against. So I just want to thank everyone for participating and sort of being part of the solution to this very difficult set of problems.
Thank you, Ms. Crook. Certainly, I would like to highlight that this is not a one-time event, and that I'm sure that the discussion will continue offline, and many information that was shared by the panelists was very triggering, as well as the ideas on the role of Parliament. I would now like to go back to Ms. Teresa Ribeiro in case she would also like to add a couple of words in the end.
Thank you. Yes, I do. And let me just underline a couple of ideas. The first one is, of course, the need to address the implementation gap. And this is precisely the effort we are doing now, after a while when a lot of research has been doing, not only for us, by us, but also by other institutions. We need now really to address this implementation gap and really focus on the need to implement the commitments in order to improve the situation. This is my first recommendation, that really joins what our dear special representative called in the beginning of this webinar. The second one is something that was floating, that is very important. It's the need of a whole of society approach. This is key if we really want to change the situation. At the same time, we really need to distinguish on the short-term measures and the long-term measures and define the good strategies for one and for the other. So that's my final words. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I have to leave the meeting because I have another meeting, but it has been a real pleasure, and I hope that we can continue to discuss this important challenge in the future. Thank you, and congratulations, Dr. Montella, for the excellent work you have been done. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again for your invaluable contribution. Dear participants, I sincerely hope you found this exchange useful and interesting. To the experts, I would just like to highlight that we took note of all your key points and recommendations, which we will put together in an outcome document that will be distributed to our members. And I think it will be very useful for their own use as well as within the PA. Clearly, there are significant policy challenges in the context of the fight against violence against women, journalists and politicians, and it is critical that we continue talking about them, but not only talking about them, but actually looking for adequate and long-lasting solutions. I would now like to give floor back to Dr. Hedy Fry for her concluding words. Dr. Fry, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And first, I want to begin by once again thanking President Setterfeld for making the time, even though she was in a very difficult position to try to speak with us from Turkey. Also to the support, extraordinary support of Roberto Montella, and to the hard work of Hannah and her team for helping to put this forward and for chairing and running the show. But I want to specifically thank the speakers today for taking the valuable time because, as I say, we quite often have seminars, we talk about things and we talk and everybody gives us data and everybody talks. But I really want to ask you, if you have not read it, to please read An Appeal to Act, which I put forward with my report in the summer. It has very specific things that I think that we need to think about what we do as parliamentarians to deal with this issue to protect journalism and freedom of the media, and to also look at the issue of violence against women in parliament. I think the appeal to act means that I want us to stop talking and start acting. And so I'm looking forward to ODIHR's Violence Against Women in Politics toolkit that they're going to send out. But I wanted to say that we talked about power, and really it is about women beginning to take and share power in the two most important influential areas in all institutions, and that is the media and, of course, parliamentarians, who are decision makers, and the media, who influence decision makers and who influence public opinion and public thought. I think the idea of these women taking power in these two very important areas is what we're talking about here. But I want to talk about power. What I found most disturbing was that many of the attacks on women journalists and many of the attacks on women parliamentarians have come from parliamentarians themselves. And I think parliamentarians actually need to consider not just political will, but to consider what the sort of example that they give to the media. They are elected by their citizens to protect democracy, to protect their citizens, and to protect rights and human rights. And I think that it's really sad to know that a lot of this, when you look at people like what is happening to Nancy Pelosi in the United States, and what is happening and the women who have been killed, like in Parliament, it's really quite distressing, and the number of women journalists that are thrown into prison. The point here is this is an OSCE PA forum. And I think what is important to note is that as politicians, we need to use our power and our influence to actually change things. Because, parliamentarians are elected from every spectrum, from every political party. And because when we see state actors, actually the states themselves actually allowing violence against media and allowing violence against parliamentarians and participating in that violence themselves. This is where parliamentary assemblies come into play. The parliamentary assembly means that we come from different political parties. We need to challenge governments. We need to make governments accountable. We need to apply codes of conduct to governments. We need to make sure that governments bring about important legislation. And I think I have to recall again the idea of regulating and making accountable the social media platforms. Social media is a good thing. And of course, when we talk about how we regulate and ensure that there is protection for journalists and parliamentarians on social media platforms, it means that we have to find that real balance in which we do not silence the media or take away media freedoms, but we do need to have protections. And I think journalists themselves need to be able to get that trust that Teresa Ribeiro talked about, that ability for people to say, I am hearing from journalists, they are a recognized group of people who have codes of conduct themselves, they have ethical codes themselves, and they are accountable, they're verifiable, and they are actually need to be able to follow the legislation and regulations. I know in many countries, in Canada, for example, the media, a criminal code applies to media. It does not apply to social media, though. It only applies to print media, broadcast media, and other forms of traditional media. And so what we know is, how do we get social media platforms to be able to be accountable? How do we ensure that people like Facebook and Google and all of these people who have now become news aggregators that mix up bona fide, truthful, factual news the journalists produce with opinions from everybody that are also thrown into the pot and are made to sound like their actual truth and news. The disinformation on COVID vaccines is a big example of how it is harmful to the public when we have disinformation being spread out there on social media. So there is a need to really, really act in terms of protecting and regulating and being accountable in terms of the social media platforms. They're the ones who don't have any regulations and aren't following any rules at all when other forms of media have to. Now, I think I want to thank you all. I don't want to go on and on because we've heard enough today, but I do think that what I want to say to you is we have it in our power as parliamentarians to hold our governments to be responsible, to hold our parliaments to be responsible, to bring about legislation, to bring about policies, to bring about programs, increasing awareness, as Ms. Cook said, It's important. If we don't identify the problem, how do we know we have a problem? And then, of course, once we identify the problem, we have a duty and a responsibility as parliamentarians to move forward. It's all about accountability. It's all about transparency. It's all about a code of conduct that we heard. And I'm hoping, and I want to thank you all for listening and for going back. And I'm hoping that you will go and speak to your parliaments about this meeting. Talk and move and be bold. Be all of you, male and female. We're not just talking about women here. We're talking about men and women parliamentarians who need to set that tone, who need to set that example, who need to move forward and be accountable for being elected. And I think it's really important that we do this. So I want to also say to the women in the world of journalism and in the world of politics, I celebrate your strength and your resilience. Never give up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fry, for your encouraging concluding remarks. Really, it's a pleasure to work with you, and we at the International Secretariat of OSCPA will do our best to support you to help our parliaments in the OSCE region to put into practice all of the things that we discussed today at the event. With this, we have come to an end of today's parliamentary web dialogue. Before I close the session, I would like to thank again our 4 experts for their invaluable insights and the participants for sharing their views on this critical topic. A big thank you goes, of course, to the OSCE-PA President, Margareta Zederfeld, and OSCE-PA Secretary General, Roberto Montella, whose strong and continuous support is always highly encouraging. And of course, to my colleagues behind the scene for helping the organization of this event, Anne-Marie, Laura, and Matthew, staff of the Canadian delegation to the OSCPA, and my dear colleagues here in the International Secretariat, Aydin, Anastasia, and Ilyas, who are sitting here next to me. The meeting is closed. Thank you.